All right, let's jump right into this explainer. We're connecting the absolute infinite straight to your own biology.
You know our minds have hard limits, right? So how on earth do we comprehend an infinite creator? Think of God's divine attributes, the Esma-ul Husna, like a literal rope for our limited minds to climb.
And it's an endless climb. We step up from basic belief, moving all the way toward total excellence. Now, what's wild is how Islamic theology slices all of reality into just 3 specific types of existence.
First is absolute existence. It's so intense, trying to prove it is literally like staring at the sun.
Then there's us. We're just possible existence. That means we completely depend on another higher power to exist.
I mean, if 3 perfectly stacked bricks obviously need a builder, how could this whole universe be random?
The third is impossible existence. You literally can't picture absolute nothingness without your brain just crashing. This setup totally flips Western philosophy on its head. It is a massive paradigm shift for human history.
See, when humans put themselves at the very top, we ironically reduce ourselves to just biology and urges. But the Islamic view? It sees us as a total masterpiece, pulling our infinite value straight from God. Which brings us to this huge historical mistake, thinking God is far away. That's exactly what birthed idolatry.
The Quran totally shatters that myth, stating God is closer than your jugular vein. No middlemen needed. So, to really know this near God, we've got to actively read these 4 distinct types of signs. Think about it. No book writes itself. The universe is literally a magnificent prism reflecting its creator. And we see 2 divine attributes constantly balancing each other out, Jalal for majesty and Jamal for beauty. You can spot this balance everywhere, the sharp thorn protecting the delicate rose, the wolf and the lamb. It's inside us too. Without the fierce protective anger of Salal, our gentle love would leave us totally defenseless. Looking at history, some figures beautifully embody gentle compassion, while others are just perfect examples of righteous, unyielding firmness. Get this, even our gallbladder secretions actually reflect this. They chemically tune us to be fiery or calm. So look inward right now. Is fierce majesty or gentle beauty driving your unique journey in the world today?
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really intricate theological discourse. We are going to build, essentially, an architectural blueprints of reality. We're going to trace this incredibly fascinating line of thought from our source material, taking us all the way from the absolute unseeable essence of God, right down to the actual chemical balances inside human biology. It's quite a journey, so let's get right into it. Let's kick things off with a huge philosophical question that's going to guide our whole exploration today. What happens when humanity becomes the ultimate measure of all things? Now, I know, on the surface, that sounds pretty empowering, right? But as we dive into the source material, we find an argument that placing humans at the absolute center of the universe actually creates this profound disruption in how we value life and ultimately how we understand truth. To navigate this, we'll follow a precise 6-step map. We'll go through understanding Allah, the categories of existence, truth versus relativity, competing paradigms, the distant God fallacy, and finally, the human mirror. Okay, section 1. Understanding the focal point of reality. Any architectural blueprint needs a solid center. And in this framework, that center is the concept of marifatullah. This translates to the continuous pursuit of understanding and knowing God. Now, the source points out something really crucial here. The human mind actually cannot grasp the absolute essence of a necessary being. Our brains literally just aren't wired for it. So marifatullah isn't about solving a math equation and being done with it. It's a vital, continuous intellectual journey. And it acts as the prerequisite for understanding the very laws of the universe. Because our brains heavily rely on concrete concepts, grasping the absolute abstract directly is basically impossible. So the text uses this beautiful metaphor. Think of the Esma, the divine attributes like mercy or justice, as a magnificent climbing rope extended from the sky. We use these attributes to pull ourselves up, hand over hand, toward that abstract understanding. Moving right along to section 2, the 3 tiers of existence. Notice how existence is separated into very strict boundaries here. First, we have the absolute or necessary existence, then the contingent or possible existence, which includes us, right? Humans and all of nature. And finally, the impossible existence, which is just absolute nothingness. The argument emphasizes that this rigid categorization completely neuters any concept of pantheism. The absolute is kept completely and fundamentally distinct from the contingent. You just can't blur those lines. But you might be wondering, if this absolute existence is the foundation of everything, why can't we see it? Well, imagine staring directly into a blinding welding machine. You experience temporary blindness, right? But not because there's no light. Actually, it's because the light is simply too intense for the biological limits of your eyes. In the exact same way, the absolute existence is unseen precisely because of the sheer, overwhelming intensity of its presence. All right, on to Section 3, the clash of truth and relativity. When the source examines ancient Greek sophism, or even modern postmodernism, that whole idea of your truth is your truth and my truth is mine, it points out a massive mathematical paradox. Think about it. A world with over 6 billion individual, highly subjective truths effectively has zero actual truth. And the consequences of this absolute relativity, they're pretty severe. If truth is entirely relative, the very foundation for moral behavior and justice absolutely collapses. You lose the entire distinction between good and evil. According to this framework, even the great moral battles of history, like Moses standing up against the Pharaoh, they just get reduced to meaningless differences of opinion. Without an absolute metric, there's literally no boundary left to protect. Let's move to Section 4 to see how these competing philosophical paradigms actually map out. Looking at these two worldviews, the source highlights a really stark contrast. In the Islamic paradigm presented here, the hierarchy flows from God to human to nature. So human beings derive their intrinsic value from a divine source. But contrast this with the Western or Greek paradigm, which places the human at the top, followed by nature and then God. The argument made here is that when humanity places itself at the top as the ultimate measure of all things, we essentially create and define our own gods. It totally shifts value away from a transcendent, absolute source. Following that human-centric worldview, the text uncovers what it calls the reductionist triad. It's basically a systematic stripping away of spiritual value. First, you have Darwin, reducing human existence to purely biological animalism. Then Freud comes along, reducing human psychological motivation down to libido and base instincts. And finally, Marx, who reduces human history to mere material conflicts, basically a fight for bones and meat. Suddenly, the human being is viewed strictly through this incredibly cold material lens. The danger of this reductionism is punctuated with a genuinely chilling anecdote from the text. It mentions a Danish university student who became a serial killer after adopting this exact extreme materialist mindset. The story goes that before committing his crimes, he literally wore a shirt that read, "Humanity is given too much value." When you strip away divine value, you risk viewing humans merely as meat and clothes, which is exactly how a dog would see them. It's a really stark warning about the total loss of inherent human dignity. This brings us to Section 5, the distant God fallacy. To really understand ancient paganism, we have to ask a deeply logical question. Why on earth did societies that actually acknowledged a supreme creator, societies that totally believed God sent the rain and made the earth, why did they still build statues out of stone and wood? Well, the core thesis here is a concept called the distant God belief. The foundational error of ancient paganism wasn't that they denied a creator. Not at all. It was believing that this creator was incredibly distant, detached, and entirely removed from daily human life. It's this idea that, sure, God is a supreme being, but he's simply way too far away to care about your specific, everyday problems. It is absolutely fascinating to look at the mechanics of this, specifically among Meccan polytheists. Because they viewed God as totally inaccessible, they created female idols, like Lat, Menat, and Uzza. They imagined them as divine intermediaries, or even, and this is wild, as God's harem. They were basically applying base human logic to the divine. To persuade a distant king, you have to appease his inner circle first. So they required this entirely fabricated system of statues and rituals just to bridge a gap that only existed in their own minds. And finally, Section 6, the human mirror. To completely dismantle that distant God fallacy, the source looks at how intimately the divine is mirrored in our physical reality. Think of Jalal, which represents majesty and protective anger. We see this embodied in the wolf or the thorn on a plant. Now contrast that with Jamal, representing beauty and calm, embodied in the sheep or the rose. The point here is that even anger has a divine purpose. It's a necessary protective force against injustice. It shows that majesty and beauty must coexist perfectly, just like the rose and its thorn. And get this macrocosmos is remarkably reflected right inside the microcosms of our own bodies.
Classical Islamic scholars actually noted that even the chemical balance of our organs, specifically the gallbladder, dictates human temperament. A high chemical balance creates an active, quickly angered protector type. A lower balance creates a highly calm, passive peacemaker. It's crazy, but our very biology is literally tuned to reflect these diverse divine attributes.
So the huge takeaway here is that human diversity is absolutely not an accident of nature. The fact that some of us are naturally fiery and others are naturally gentle, it's described as a divine division of labor. Society desperately needs both the fierce protectors who are going to stand up against injustice and the gentle peacemakers who hold our communities together. It is a perfectly calibrated system reflecting the exact names of God through human action.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a deeply personal question to think about regarding your own worldview. Based on the entire architectural blueprint we've just explored, are you constantly searching for meaning and a distant God through external intermediaries? Or are you looking within, recognizing a reality that is fundamentally closer to you than your own jugular vein? The answer to that question really changes how you measure the whole world. Thanks for joining me today.
Imagine you are out on the open ocean. Like you're at the helm of a ship, miles away from any coastline, and you are relying entirely on the instruments in front of you.
Right, completely dependent on the compass.
Exactly. And there is this terrifying, inescapable reality about navigating by compass. If your heading is off by just 1 single degree, a deviation so small it is barely a fraction of a millimeter on that physical dial, you probably won't notice it for the first few hours.
Oh, absolutely not. Even after a day of sailing, you might still feel like you were perfectly on track.
Yeah, but if you keep sailing with that microscopic error for a few weeks, you do not just miss your target port, you end up on an entirely different continent.
Well, that is the insidious nature of foundational errors, isn't it? And it doesn't seem completely insignificant at the starting point. But deviation is, it's a multiplier.
A multiplier, right.
Yeah, it uses time and distance to take a tiny error in trajectory and turn it into a massive, undeniable divergence in reality.
And that exact same principle applies directly to how we build our worldview. Like if the very foundational starting point of how you view reality, how you define existence, morality, or your own purpose, if that is off by just a fraction of a degree, the end result of your life is going to look radically different.
Right.
How you treat the person sitting next to you on the bus, how you handle grief, how you define justice, all of it ends up kilometers away from where it otherwise would have been. So, welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
For you listening today, whether you are actively studying theology or, you are just someone who loves dismantling complex, heavy ideas to see how the gears work, we are going on a massive journey.
We really are.
We are unpacking a deeply philosophical, highly rigorous lecture by Mustafa İslamoğlu. It is titled Esma'ul Husna Desleri 8-1 Esbor. Basically, it serves as an introduction to the beautiful names of God.
And what makes this material so compelling isn't just the history. It is a structural examination of that navigational compass we just talked about.
Yeah.
This lecture asks a profoundly intimidating question. It asks, how does our foundational understanding of existence, and specifically, the concept of a creator, how does that dictate absolutely everything else down the line?
It's all connected.
Exactly. It argues that a millimeter of deviation in how you define the divine results in a total systemic collapse of human morality and purpose.
Which is a huge claim. So our mission today is to extract the absolute core of this framework. We are bridging ancient Islamic theology, the physical hardware limitations of the human brain, and some incredibly sharp, unapologetic critiques of modern Western philosophy.
It definitely doesn't pull any punches.
No, it doesn't. But before we get into the weeds, I want to make a crucial disclaimer for you, the listener. Throughout this deep dive, we are going to explore the source material's direct pushback against some major philosophical and political concepts.
Things like postmodernism, secular reductionism, historical polytheism, all of that.
Right. And we are here as intellectual anthropologists. We are not endorsing, validating, or taking sides on these viewpoints. Our goal is entirely impartial. We are taking these complex, sometimes provocative arguments from the source material, holding them up to the light, and turning them around so you can see exactly how this specific worldview is constructed.
We are mapping the architecture of a very specific lens on reality. And To understand a building, you really have to look at the foundation first.
So let's look at the foundation, because the lecture doesn't actually open with a discussion on God's names, which I found surprising.
Yeah, it takes a detour.
It opens with a reflection on human speech, specifically looking at a famous prayer by the prophet Moses. Moses has just received this monumental, terrifying command to go confront Pharaoh.
And Pharaoh isn't just a bad guy. I mean, he is the ultimate tyrant, a man claiming literal divinity.
Right. And Moses, facing this impossible task, prays for the knot in his tongue to be untied so that his words can be understood. Now, most of us read that and think, okay, Moses had a stutter, or he was just really nervous about public speaking.
Which is the common interpretation, yeah.
But the source takes this in a totally different, highly philosophical direction. It argues that true eloquence has very little to do with the physical tongue.
Yeah, the lecture draws a sharp, really vital distinction using two Arabic terms that share a root, mantuk and matuk.
Okay, break those down for us.
So mantuk refers to the spoken word itself, like the actual audio leaving your lips. Mantuk, on the other hand, is the logic, the reason, the engaged mind functioning behind those words.
Got it.
The argument presented here is that mantuk is entirely subordinate to mentuk. If the internal logic isn't churning, if the mind isn't actively producing substance, then the tongue is just a mechanical flap of meat making empty noise.
I think about that in the context of modern society all the time. Like, we are surrounded by people who are incredibly gifted at mantuk. We have politicians, influencers, corporate speakers who just have these silver tongues.
Oh, absolutely. They can speak for an hour without stuttering once.
Yeah, but when they finish, you realize they haven't actually said anything at all. Having a silver tongue without an engaged mind and heart is like having a perfectly polished, million-dollar sports car sitting in your driveway with absolutely no engine under the hood.
That's a great way to put it.
It catches the eye, it looks impressive, but it is fundamentally incapable of taking you anywhere.
That is a perfect modern parallel. And the source actually deepens this by bringing in Persian linguistics, noting that the words for tongue and heart are deeply intertwined.
Interesting.
Yeah, the physiological pipeline of truth, according to this framework, is very specific. The heart, representing intention and spiritual core, must give the command. Then the mind must process that command into coherent logic.
So it's a sequence.
Exactly. And only after that internal alignment occurs does the tongue have permission to speak. Anything else is just noise.
But why open a massive theological series on the names of God with a lesson on intentional speech? I struggled with that connection at first.
It does seem like a leap.
It does, but the speaker pivots immediately from this internal alignment of logic and intention to the concept of time. He mentions almost casually that this specific lecture is the final installment of a series that took 16 years to complete.
16 years.
16 years of consistent focus on one overarching topic. And that forces a heavy realization about the passage of time.
It does. And the synthesis the source makes here is breathtaking, honestly. It asserts that every single human being is marooned in time. Like, we are universally subject to its passage.
We can't escape it.
Right. However, we have a binary choice in how we exist within that flow. If you can cultivate that internal alignment we just discussed, if your heart, mind, and actions are sync, allowing you to fully account for your present moment, your here and now, you elevate yourself.
Elevate how?
You become the subject of your life. The lecture uses the Turkish word uzna. You are the one performing the action.
The active participant in reality.
Precisely. But if you lack that alignment, if you cannot account for your present moment and you are just drifting on autopilot, you lose that status. You downgrade yourself to being merely the object, the nest egg.
It's just a passive object.
Yeah, you become passive, inert material that is simply pushed around, eroded, and eventually destroyed by time.
Man, that is such a heavy, demanding way to start a lesson. It demands that the listener stop being passive. So I ask you, listening to this right now, are you the subject of your time today? Are you moving with intentionality, or are you just an object being dragged along by your calendar, molded by the ticking of the clock?
It's a tough mirror to look into.
Are you driving the car, or are you just luggage in the trunk? It establishes incredibly high stakes. You cannot just casually consume what comes next. You really have to be awake. Because what comes next is the gravitational center of this entire worldview, the concept of Allah.
And the visual metaphor the source uses to explain this concept is striking. It asks us to visualize a tasbih, the traditional 99-bead rosary used in Islamic prayer.
Right.
Now, each of the standard beads on this rosary represents one of the Esma-ul Husna, the beautiful names or attributes of the divine. You have beads for the merciful, the just, the all-knowing, the protector. But the name Allah is not one of those standard beads.
No, it occupies a completely different structural category. The lecture describes Allah as the imame. If you've ever held a physical rosary, the imame is that distinct, elongated bead at the very top.
Yeah, the leading piece.
Exactly. It gathers the two ends of the string and ties the entire loop together. Every other bead, every other divine attribute relies entirely on that primary focal point to stay on the string. Without the imam, the string snaps and all the other attributes just scatter and lose their cohesive meaning.
It is the anchor of singularity. And the speaker reinforces this by diving into the linguistics of the word itself. The word Allah is classified as ism, a proper, completely unique noun.
I found the linguistic argument really fascinating because it highlights something we kind of take for granted in everyday language. The speaker points out that human names are inherently pluralizable. Like you can walk into a room and say, will all the Ahmeds please stand up? Or we have 3 Sarahs in the office.
Right. The names refer to individuals, but the category can hold multiples.
Exactly. But linguistically, conceptually, and philosophically, the word Allah resists pluralization entirely. There are no Allahs. It denotes an absolute infinite singularity that cannot be duplicated or categorized alongside anything else.
And because we're dealing with absolute infinite singularity, the source argues that our reaction to this concept cannot merely be intellectual. Like, if you treat this just as a linguistic curiosity or a philosophical puzzle, you are missing the reality of what it is.
It's not just a thought experiment.
No, the speaker insists that anyone who genuinely begins to comprehend the sheer weight, the infinite mass of this concept, should physically tremble. It should induce a cellular shock. If facing the concept of the absolute does not shake you to your core, then you haven't actually understood what you're looking at.
Okay, let's pause and really unpack this, because this is where my modern skeptical brain starts throwing up red flags.
Fair enough. Let's hear it.
I hear this argument that God is an absolute infinite essence, what the text calls the Zat. And the text readily admits, openly, that the human brain is fundamentally incapable of comprehending this infinite essence. Like, we literally do not have the cognitive hardware to process infinity.
That's correct.
So my challenge to this framework is, if the speaker admits we cannot possibly understand the Zat, why are we spending 16 years talking about it? Why try to map something that you admit is unmappable? Doesn't that render all theology a total fool's errand?
That is the exact tension the lecture addresses next, and it does so by breaking down the mechanics of human epistemology.
Which is the study of how we know things.
Right. Epistemology is simply how we acquire knowledge. The source explains that human cognition is bound by very rigid operational mechanisms. We think via deduction, working from a general rule to a specific instance. We think via induction, taking specific observations to form a general rule. Or we think via analogy, understanding one thing by comparing it to another.
Right. Those are the basic tools in our cognitive toolbox.
But here is the critical limitation. For any of those 3 tools to function, the human mind requires what the text calls a faun, a background.
Like a literal background.
Think of a painter. A painter can have the most brilliant vision in their head and the finest paints in the world, but if they do not have a canvas, a finite surface with borders and friction, they cannot paint. The human mind works exactly the same way. It needs boundaries, a starting point, and an end point to grip onto.
So we need a conceptual canvas.
Exactly. But the absolute essence of God, the Zat, has no boundaries.
Yeah.
It has no beginning, no end, no edges. Because there are no borders, the human mind has absolutely no surface to grip. When our cognitive tools try to grasp the infinite essence, they simply slide off into the void.
So we are completely locked out of understanding the essence. The hardware physically prevents it.
We're locked out of the Zat, but this is the key. We are not locked out of the Sifat, the attributes, and the Uzma, the names. And this is where the lecture introduces what I consider the most beautiful and profound metaphor in the entire text. It describes these names and attributes as hablullah, literal ropes let down from heaven.
Ropes let down to our limited bandwidth. Because we are down here in the mud, unable to grasp the infinite sky, the infinite provides us with these conceptual ropes.
Precisely. We cannot comprehend the infinite essence of a creator, but we can look at the finite world around us. We can witness an act of profound mercy between a mother and her child, and use that finite observation as a rope to pull our understanding up toward the concept of the merciful.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, we can witness the intricate balance of an ecosystem and use that to climb toward the all-knowing. We are climbing these conceptual ropes, moving from the physical to the metaphysical.
And the lecture posits that climbing these ropes isn't just about religious devotion. It is literally how humanity learns abstract thinking.
It argues that divine revelation is essentially a historical masterclass designed to elevate human cognition. It pulls us out of purely sensory, animalistic existence and forces us to develop the capacity to understand the abstract, the unseen, the conceptual.
Which honestly flips my entire understanding of idolatry on its head.
How so?
Well, when we learn about ancient history, we are usually taught that idolatry, what the text calls shirk, was just a primitive religious preference. Like, people like statues, so they worship statues.
Right, a stylistic choice.
Exactly. But if we follow the logic of this lecture, idolatry is not a religious failure. It is a massive failure of cognitive development.
It is a symptom of a stunted mind. The framework suggests that human beings have an innate, undeniable drive to orient themselves toward a higher power. It's built into our operating system.
We have to look up.
Yeah. But if an individual or a society fails to develop the capacity for abstract thought, if they cannot mentally climb those ropes let down from heaven, their mind remains trapped in the concrete, material world.
So the mind demands a god, but the brain can only process physical matter.
Exactly. And the resulting compromise is idolatry. The mind takes the absolute, infinite, incomprehensible concept of the divine and violently shrinks it down. It forces the infinite into a piece of carved wood or a stone statue or a golden calf.
It concretizes the divine because it lacks the maturity to handle the abstract reality of the unseen. Idolatry is just the mind demanding something it can touch. And honestly, if you look at the modern world, we haven't stopped doing this. We've just changed the materials.
Oh, that's an interesting point.
Yeah, like we might not carve statues of rain gods anymore, but we take abstract concepts like security, value, and meaning, and we shrink them down into concrete numbers in a bank account or follower counts on social media.
Wow.
We are still concretizing our highest values because the abstract is just too difficult to hold on to.
That is a phenomenal extrapolation. And understanding that human limitation, our desperate need to categorize reality, brings us directly to how this worldview actually organizes existence itself. The source presents a rigid system of Islamic ontology.
Ontology being the philosophical study of being or existence.
Right.
Okay, let's look at the filing cabinet of reality. How does this framework categorize everything that is?
It divides everything imaginable into three distinct categories. The first category is the bedrock of the entire system. It's called Varlik. This translates to absolute or necessary existence.
Absolute existence.
Yes. This category belongs solely to God. It describes an existence that does not depend on any external factor, cause, or prerequisite. It is the uncaused cause. It must exist in order for anything else to have the possibility of existing.
The necessary existence.
Oh.
It is the engine that powers the rest of the factory. Okay, what is the second category?
The second category is Mumkin Varlik, which translates to contingent or possible existence. This category contains literally everything else. The universe, the stars, the microphone you are speaking into, you and me. We are all possible.
I have to admit, being labeled as a contingent existence deals a slight blow to the ego. What does it actually mean, philosophically, to be contingent?
It means that your existence is not a given. You are something that could exist but also could not exist. There is no fundamental law of reality that demands you must be here.
Ouch.
I know, right? Your presence in reality is entirely dependent on an external force, the necessary existence, making a choice to bring you from non-existence into existence. We did not create ourselves, and we do not sustain ourselves. We are entirely reliant on the Varlik.
We are just possibilities that were actualized by something else. That makes sense. Well,
what is the final category?
The third category is Muhal, or Mumteni Varlik. This translates to impossible existence. It is the concept of absolute total nothingness.
Now, diving into that first category, the absolute necessary existence brings up the most common fundamental objection people have to theology.
Yeah.
The eternal question, if God is this necessary existence and he is supposedly everywhere, why can't I see him? Why is he invisible?
Right, the classic question.
And the lecture provides an answer to this that absolutely blew my mind. It uses the analogy of a welding arc.
It is a stunning use of physical phenomena to explain metaphysical reality.
Let's walk through it.
Yeah.
When people ask why God is unseen, they usually assume it is because God is hiding or because God is absent from the physical space. The lecture argues the exact opposite. God is not unseen because of absence. God is unseen because of the sheer, overwhelming, unmitigated intensity of his presence.
The intensity is key. Think about staring directly at the tip of a welding tool while it's active. If you look at that arc without a heavy protective mask, you experience flash blindness. When your vision goes dark, it isn't because the light disappeared. It goes dark because there is too much light. The intensity of the light completely overloads the capacity of your retina.
This connects perfectly back to what we discussed about cognitive hardware. Our physical senses are incredibly fragile and operate on very narrow bandwidths. I mean, the human ear only registers frequencies between 20 and 20,000 hertz.
Everything outside of that is silence to us.
Exactly. Even if the universe is screaming, our eyes only perceive a minuscule fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. We cannot see ultraviolet or infrared light without technology. The lecture takes these biological limits and applies them to our spiritual perception.
So the bandwidth just gets fried.
Yeah, the sheer intensity of the Vasikvarlik, the necessary existence, completely overloads the finite bandwidth of a contingent being.
It is blinding presence, not absence. And because this presence is the fundamentally necessary existence, the lecture takes a really interesting stance on theological debates. It argues that trying to construct complex, logical proofs to prove God's existence is actually missing the point entirely. It views it as a redundant, almost absurd exercise.
Because you do not need to prove the existence of the very foundation of reality. Instead, the source turns the argument around and attacks the opposing philosophical premise, the attempt to argue for the concept of nothingness or the idea that the universe spontaneously generated from absolute zero.
Trying to prove nothingness is a massive philosophical trap.
It is a paradox that collapses on itself immediately. The lecture points out the linguistic trap first. The very millisecond you utter the word nothing, you have failed.
Because it's a word.
By giving it a noun, a linguistic identity, you have turned it into a something within your language framework. But the cognitive trap is even deeper. If you sit quietly in a room, close your eyes, and try with all your might to imagine absolute, pure nothingness, no space, no time, no matter, no blackness, you cannot do it.
Because the very act of trying to imagine requires an existing brain firing existing neurons within existing time and space. The thought process itself requires existence.
Exactly. The concept of absolute nothingness bankrupts itself before the human mind can even fully render it. Existence is the inescapable default.
The lecture gets incredibly poetic to drive this inescapability home. It points out that even the involuntary physiological process of breathing serves as a testament to this reality. In Arabic, the sound of an exhale, the rush of air leaving the lungs, phonetically mirrors the word hu, which translates to he, referring to the divine. Yeah. The lecture suggests that every single breath you take, from the moment you are born to your final gasp, whether you consider yourself a devout believer or a staunch atheist, is a constant, rhythmic, biological affirmation of existence. Your body is testifying to the necessary existence, even if your conscious mind is denying it.
It grounds the metaphysical argument right in the physical body. And from that poetic biological reality, the lecture pivots to a very grounded, logical strike against the idea that the universe is a product of random coincidence. To do this, it uses a remarkably simple thought experiment involving 3 bricks.
The 3 bricks analogy. It is so basic, but it completely dismantled my mental defenses. Imagine you are walking down a path in the woods miles from civilization. You come across a clearing, and sitting on the ground are 3 standard clay bricks, stacked perfectly on top of one another. The edges are aligned. Now, when you see that, your mind immediately goes to work. You might generate 50 different hypotheses about who put them there. Was it a hiker marking a trail? Was it a kid playing? Did someone drop them from a plane? You can debate the who and the why forever, but the lecture points out the one hypothesis your brain will absolutely never entertain.
You will never, under any circumstances, look at those 3 stacked bricks and conclude that the wind eroded some clay, a freak storm baked them into perfect rectangles, and a localized tornado stacked them neatly on top of each other by pure random coincidence.
Never. The human mind instantly rejects that as utterly absurd.
Our brain demands a builder for 3 simple blocks of dirt.
Which brings us to the core of the lecture's argument here. If human intellect violently refuses to accept that 3 primitive bricks could stack themselves by chance, how can that same intellect look at the staggering, incomprehensible complexity of the cosmos and call it a coincidence?
It's a profound contradiction.
Look at the precise tuning of the gravitational constant. Look at the staggering complexity of cellular biology, where a single strand of DNA contains more organized data than a massive library. To look at the entire universe and attribute it to a cosmic roll of the dice, while demanding an intelligent creator for 3 bricks, is framed by the source as an inexcusable, almost willful cognitive dissonance.
You cannot logically demand a conscious architect for a tiny stack of mud and then look at the human eye and say, wow, random mutations really got lucky here.
Right.
The lecture frames that as intellectual dishonesty. And if the universe isn't a random coincidence, as the brick analogy strongly suggests, then what do we make of philosophical systems that claim the physical universe isn't even real? Because the source takes a massive, aggressive swing at that exact idea next.
The lecture transitions into a forceful critique of philosophies that frame the material world as merely an illusion. Historically, this traces back to certain schools of ancient Greek sophism, but it also appears in various mystical traditions and modern simulation theories, this pervasive idea that reality is just a veil, a matrix, or that the physical world is only acting as if it exists.
And the speaker of the lecture clearly has zero patience for this concept.
Zero. There is a moment of very dark practical humor in the text. The speaker suggests that if a philosopher ever approaches you and seriously argues that nothing is real and the physical world is entirely an illusion, you should give them a very hard physical slap across the face.
I love that.
And when they inevitably get angry and demand to know why you hit them, you simply use their own philosophy against them. You tell them, why are you angry? My hand doesn't actually exist. Your face is just an illusion. And that slap never happened.
It is a visceral, funny image, but the theological and philosophical point beneath it is deadly serious. The source argues that accepting the premise that the material world is an illusion is not just a quirky thought experiment, it is incredibly dangerous. If you declare reality to be fake, you instantly and permanently destroy the entire foundation of human morality.
Walk me through that causality. Why does calling the world an illusion destroy morality?
Because morality requires stakes. It requires actual harm and actual benefit to actual beings. If poverty is just an illusion, why fight it? If oppression is just a simulation, why stand up to a tyrant?
There's no reason to.
Exactly. The lecture argues that you cannot build a system of justice on a foundation of mirages. This historical critique of sophism is then seamlessly connected to the source's critique of a very modern movement, which is postmodernism.
This is where the ancient theology violently collides with modern sociology. The lecture targets postmodernism's central tenet, that truth is subjective. The idea that there is no overarching absolute truth, but rather a collection of personal narratives. You have your truth, and I have my truth.
Right. At the time this lecture was given, the global population was roughly 6.5 billion. The speaker uses that metric to tear into the postmodern framework.
The critique here is mathematically ruthless. The source posits that if you claim there are 6.5 billion individual, equally valid subjective truths, you are functionally admitting that there is zero actual truth.
If everything is true, nothing is true.
Exactly. And again, to keep things impartial, if we analyze the mechanics of this argument just as it's presented, we see exactly what the speaker fears about the postmodern framework. If there is no absolute truth, which, in the worldview being presented, must be anchored by an absolute God, then there are no objective boundaries left in human behavior.
And if there are no objective boundaries, the concept of justice completely disintegrates. Think about how this applies to history, or even current events. The lecture brings up the ancient conflict of Moses standing against Pharaoh, or Abraham standing against Nimrod. Right, classic showdowns.
In a framework anchored by absolute truth, those are cosmic battles between objective good and objective evil. Moses is right, Pharaoh is a tyrant. But what happens if you apply the postmodern lens to that conflict?
Well, in a purely subjective framework, you strip away the moral weight entirely. You can no longer definitively claim that Pharaoh was objectively evil. You are forced to concede that Moses simply had his truth, and Pharaoh had his truth, and they had a disagreement over power.
That's chilling.
It flattens the moral landscape. It takes the most vital struggles for human rights and justice and reduces them to mere subjective disagreements, where the winner is simply whoever has the most power to enforce their narrative.
It is a paralyzing thought experiment. If truth is just a matter of perspective, then who are you to impose your specific truth on an oppressor? It makes the fight for justice intellectually impossible. And that chilling realization brings us to what I consider the most intense, consequential part of this entire deep dive. We are looking at the blueprint of reality and the profound danger of reductionism.
The lecture moves into a comparative analysis here, contrasting two entirely different structural blueprints for how reality is ordered and how value is assigned within that reality.
Yeah. If you are building a house, you need an architectural blueprint. If the blueprint dictates that the foundation goes at the bottom and the roof goes at the top, you end up with a functional house that protects you.
Naturally.
But if you hold that blueprint upside down, if you try to build the foundation in the sky and put the roof in the dirt, the entire structure collapses on top of you. The lecture argues that society is currently trying to live inside an upside-down house.
Let's examine the first blueprint, which the source defines as the Islamic cognitive framework. In this vertical structure of reality, God is placed at the absolute top as the necessary existence. Below God is the human being, and below the human being is nature, or the material universe.
Okay, God, then human, then nature.
Yes. In this specific hierarchy, humans derive their supreme inherent value and dignity precisely because they are created by and spiritually linked to the divine entity above them. They are entrusted with stewardship over nature, but their worth is anchored upwards.
The value flows from the top down. Okay, what is the contrasting blueprint?
The contrasting blueprint, which the text identifies as the Western or Greek philosophical framework, completely inverts this hierarchy. It places the human being at the very top. Human first, then nature, then God, if God is included at all.
The upside-down house.
Exactly. In this model, man is the measure of all things.
Yeah.
The human intellect is the ultimate authority in the universe. And in the most extreme secular versions of this blueprint, man actually invents the concept of God to serve psychological or societal needs.
The ceiling becomes the floor. The creator becomes the creation. What are the mechanical consequences of this inverted blueprint? Because to a lot of modern listeners, putting humans at the top sounds empowering. It sounds like humanism. Why does the lecture view it as a catastrophe?
The consequences, according to the logic of the source, are inherently degrading. It relies on a simple rule of derivation. If human beings remove the divine from above them, they can no longer derive their intrinsic value from a higher, sacred source.
Because there's nothing above them anymore.
Right. Left with nothing above them, they are forced to look down to the material world to define themselves. They are forced to define themselves by their base parts. The text calls this process reductionism.
We strip away the transcendent soul, and we are left trying to find meaning in our biology.
Exactly. And the lecture identifies three major historical figures who acted as the primary architects or operators of this reductionism. It argues that Charles Darwin reduced the human being purely to the status of an animal, stripping away the metaphysical soul and leaving only biological imperative.
Okay.
It argues that Sigmund Freud reduced human psychology, motivation, and aspiration down to libido, trauma, and basic biological lust. And finally, it argues that Karl Marx reduced the entirety of human history, culture, and struggle to purely material economics, a fight over bones and resources.
And I want to reiterate our impartiality here for the listener. We aren't litigating the scientific validity of evolution or the economic nuances of Marxism. We are examining how this specific theological framework views the impact of those ideas on the human soul.
That's a vital distinction.
The lecture argues that by embracing these three operators, society successfully stripped away the sacred and left only meat, urges, and capital. And to illustrate the real-world horror of this reductionism, the speaker brings in some genuinely chilling examples.
The examples are stark because they represent the logical endpoint of the inverted blueprint. The text references a historical serial killer who, during his confession, referred to his victims simply as meat.
Just meat.
Yes, he did not see human beings with souls, families, or inherent dignity. Because he operated in a fully reduced framework, he literally only saw biological matter.
The lecture also points to a tragic event where a Danish student murdered his peers. The detail that stands out, the detail the speaker focuses on, is that during the act, the student was wearing a shirt that read, "Humanity is overrated."
It is a terrifying phrase. But if you look at it strictly through the lens of pure reductionism, the student's logic tracks. I mean, if human beings are just advanced apes, driven only by blind biological lust, violently competing for temporary material resources on a dying rock and a random universe, why shouldn't they be overrated?
There's no objective value.
Right. Without the divine link, on what objective basis do you argue that a human life is sacred? Why is a human life more valuable than a blade of grass if both are just random accidents of chemistry?
To really drive this horrific realization home, the speaker uses one final brutal thought experiment. He asks the audience to imagine asking a dog to define a human being. What does the dog see when it looks at you?
That's a fascinating question.
Right. The dog does not perceive a philosopher or a poet or a creature carrying a divine spark. The dog lacks the capacity for that abstract elevation. To the dog, a human being is just a piece of meat and bones wearing clothes.
And the profound warning of the lecture is this. When modern human beings fully embrace secular reductionism, they're essentially adopting the dog's perspective of themselves. They begin to look at their neighbors, their communities, and themselves in the mirror and see nothing more than meat and bones.
It's a total degradation.
It results in the total loss of what Islamic theology calls israfi malukat, the status of humanity as the most honored and noble of all creations.
It is a devastating critique. How we define the structure of reality directly, mathematically dictates how much value we place on the life of the person standing next to us. It doesn't get more consequential than that.
It really doesn't.
Now, having thoroughly dismantled modern reductionism, the lecture takes an unexpected turn. It shifts its focus backward in time, looking at the anatomy of ancient polytheism, specifically the Jahiliyyah period of pre-Islamic Mecca.
It is a fascinating pivot, because the text reveals a historical reality that shocks many people. The common assumption about the Meccan polytheists is that they were complete atheists who just happened to worship rocks, or that they genuinely believed the wooden idols carved by their own hands actually created the heavens and the earth.
That's what I always pictured.
Most people do. But the lecture clarifies that this is historically inaccurate. The masses in ancient Mecca actually believed in a supreme, all-powerful creator God. If you approached a Meccan pagan and asked, "Who created the heavens and sent down the rain?" they would readily answer, Allah.
Wait, let me make sure I understand this. They already believe in the supreme creator. They knew God made the universe. So why in the world did they have hundreds of stone and wooden idols surrounding the Kaaba? What purpose did the idols serve if they already believed in God?
This question unveils a profound psychological insight into human insecurity. The source explained that while the polytheists believed in God, the version of God they constructed in their minds was a distant God.
A distant God.
Yes. They acknowledged that God created the cosmos, but they imagined him as an entity who was simply too majestic, too far away, or perhaps too occupied with running the universe to be bothered with the mundane, daily struggles of ordinary human beings.
Too big to care about the little thing.
Exactly. He was a king sitting in a fortress light years away. Because they perceived this massive distance, they felt an overwhelming need for intercessors. They needed middlemen to bridge the terrifying gap between their small lives and the infinite.
And that is the exact void the idols filled. The text brings up some wild historical imagery regarding the three major idols in Mecca, Lat, Manat, and Uzza. The pagans didn't just view these idols as inanimate statues. They believed these idols represented powerful female angels.
Yeah.
The lecture actually uses the phrase that they viewed these angels almost like God's harem.
It sounds incredibly primitive to modern ears, but if you analyze the psychological logic of the polytheists, it makes perfect sense. Imagine you are a lardy peasant, and you desperately need a favor from an incredibly powerful, intimidating, distant emperor. You are terrified to walk directly up to his throne.
So you look for a back door?
Exactly.
Yeah.
What do? You find his favorite minister or his favorite wife, you flatter them, you bring them gifts and offerings, hoping that they will take your request and whisper it into the emperor's ear on your behalf.
It is celestial lobbying. They were making sacrifices to the idols, hoping the idols would use their VIP access to flatter God and get them rain or victory in battle.
It's a system built entirely on the anxiety of distance. The lecture argues that this distant God framework is the absolute root of spiritual corruption. It fundamentally severs the direct relationship between the created and the creator.
Wow.
And interestingly, the source does not limit this critique to ancient pagans. It argues that any system requiring a middleman suffers from this corruption, specifically applying this critique to Trinitarian Christianity as well.
Let's explore that impartially, just tracking the lecture's argument. How does the text view the concept of the Trinity through this lens?
The argument presented is that defining God as a Trinity is, ironically, a highly secular act.
Secular? How so?
Because the lecture views it as human beings taking it upon themselves to intellectually appoint the structure of the divine nature. By creating a system where God must be accessed through a specific manifestation or intermediary, the source argues that humans are essentially acting as the authority over God, defining his mechanics rather than submitting to his absolute singularity. It is another form of creating a bridge because the gap feels too wide.
So the disease is the belief in distance. What is the cure? How does the Quranic worldview, as presented in the lecture, counter this desperate need to lobby the heavens?
The cure is the radical introduction of the near God. The lecture centers on the famous Quranic verse, which states that God is closer to you than your jugular vein.
Closer than the jugular vein. Think about the physical intimacy of that imagery. The jugular vein is inside your own neck, pumping your own blood to your own brain. It is the core of your biological existence.
It doesn't get closer than that.
Right. If the creator of the cosmos is closer to you than your own internal biology, the entire architecture of intermediaries completely collapses. You don't need a stone idol, you don't need a saint, you don't need a priest, and you don't need to bribe a celestial lobbyist. You just speak and you are heard instantly.
And the lecture doesn't just leave this as high theology. It applies it directly to human psychology and parenting. It offers deeply practical advice. It suggests that if you want to protect your children, if you want to equip them with an unbreakable psychological armor to survive a brutal world, you must instill in them the reality of the near God.
I love this application.
Yeah, teach them that the ultimate authority, the ultimate source of justice and love is intimately close and sees absolutely everything.
Because if a child truly internalizes that, if they believe they are constantly accompanied by the ultimate truth, they will never feel the desperate need to seek validation from corrupt temporary sources. They won't need to build their own modern idols out of social media approval or toxic relationships.
Right, they have a solid core.
The near God acts as a self-regulating, comforting shield against the profound anxieties and loneliness of human life.
It creates a sovereign individual who only bows to the absolute, making them immune to the tyranny of the contingent world.
This philosophical journey brings us to our final frontier. We have discussed the abstract limits of the mind, the danger of reductionist philosophies, and the psychology of polytheism. Now the lecture enters its concluding phase by exploring how these massive, invisible divine attributes actually manifest in the physical, tangible, messy world we wake up in every day.
The source introduces the vital concept of ayat-kainat, which translates to the signs or the verses of the universe. The core argument here is that the physical universe is not just a random collection of matter, it is a meticulously authored book.
And we are back to the bricks.
Exactly. If we refer back to the analogy of the 3 bricks, if a book exists, there is an author. And an author's distinct personality, their tone, their attributes, inevitably bleed into the pages of their work.
We are living inside the book, and we can see the author's fingerprints. The lecture categorizes these visible divine attributes into 2 primary contrasting themes, Salal and Samal.
These 2 concepts are the twin pillars of manifestation. Salal represents the attributes of majesty, wrath, absolute power, justice, and awe. It is the fire.
Okay, fire.
Samal, on the other hand, represents beauty, grace, infinite mercy, gentleness, and compassion. It is the calm. The source argues that if you know how to read the book of nature, you see these twin attributes perfectly reflected and balanced everywhere you look.
The imagery used in the text to illustrate this is incredibly vivid. It tells us to look at the animal kingdom. When you look at a wolf on a hunt, its strength, its ferocity, the raw power of its survival, you are witnessing a biological reflection of Salal.
Pure power.
But when you look at a newborn lamb, its fragility, its softness, its innocence, you are witnessing a reflection of Samal. And it exists even closer than that. Look at a single rose bush in a garden. The velvet petals of the rose, the intoxicating scent, the vibrant color, that is pure Samal drawing you in with beauty.
But then you have the stem.
Right. Reach for the stem and you feel the sharp, unyielding prick of the thorn. The thorn is Salal, power and protection.
And crucially, the lecture points out that the rose and the thorn are not in conflict. They are not opposing forces trying to destroy each other. They are in perfect harmony. The beauty of the rose requires the wrath of the thorn to survive in a hostile world. They are 2 sides of the same divine coin.
But this duality raises a massive foundational question. It is a question that causes many people to abandon faith entirely. If God is all good, and if humans are supposedly the Ishref Malakat, the most honored creation, then why did the Creator encode human biology with emotions like anger and lust?
The problem of human nature.
Yeah. These are the exact primal urges that cause wars, abuse, exploitation, and so much horrific sin in the world. Why put the violent thorn of Sal onto the human being?
This is where the lecture's synthesis of human nature becomes profoundly defensive of our design. The source refuses to accept the premise that anger or desire are inherently evil. Instead, it argues that anger is the absolute necessary shield for love.
Anger is the shield for love. That sounds counterintuitive. Let's break that down.
Think about it structurally. If a human being was designed entirely of Samal, if they possessed absolutely no capacity for anger, aggression, or force, they would be entirely passive.
A sitting duck.
Right. They could not defend their children from a predator. They could not stand up against a tyrant exploiting the weak. They could not fight for justice. An absence of anger in the face of horrific injustice is not a moral virtue. It is cowardice. It is a fatal weakness.
That makes total sense.
Similarly, biological lust or desire is what ensures that human beings seek out food to survive, build shelters, and reproduce to ensure the continuation of the species.
So the emotions themselves are completely morally neutral. They are just raw energy. They are tools.
Exactly. They are tools assigned to us to navigate a contingent world. The fin, according to the strict logic of this framework, does not lie in possessing the emotion. The sin occurs only in its misuse when the emotion loses its balance and leaves its proper, intended center.
When it goes rogue.
Right. When the power of anger is used to oppress the innocent rather than protect them, the tool has become a weapon of sin. When desire is used to exploit another human being rather than to build connection and family, it becomes a sin. The fault is in the operator, not the tool.
Okay, we are about to cross the threshold into what I genuinely think is the most surprising, wild claim in this entire deep dive. We're moving from high philosophy and psychological theory straight into literal human biology.
Here we go.
The text claims that these divine attributes of Salal and Samal, this fire and calm, do not just exist as abstract personality traits, they manifest physically in our chemical makeup.
It is a fascinating, almost jarring intersection of ancient medical theory and Islamic theology. The lecture references historical Islamic scholars and physicians who deeply believed that the physical chemical composition of a person's body directly determined their spiritual temperament.
Okay.
And they pinpointed a very specific biological source for this, the amount of fluid in a person's gallbladder, known in Turkish as the ud-kazesi.
The gallbladder. Of all the majestic organs in the human body, the brain, the heart, the lungs, the anchor of our spiritual temperament is the fluid in the gallbladder.
It seems highly specific, but the text outlines the historical theory clearly. It posits that if an individual naturally possesses a high concentration of this specific biological fluid, their internal chemistry makes them inherently fiery, highly active, aggressive, and incredibly quick to action.
So they run hot.
Biologically and temperamentally, they are a physical manifestation of the divine attribute of Salah. The lecture uses the second caliph of Islam, Omar, as the prime historical example of this.
Omar the Great.
Right. Omar was famously a powerhouse of a man, known for his fierce, terrifying sense of justice, his power, and his refusal to back down from confrontation. He was pure Salah.
Okay, so a high amount of fluid creates the fire of Omar. What is the biological flip side?
Conversely, an individual with a naturally lower amount of this gallbladder fluid is biologically predisposed to be calm, highly patient, gentle, and reflective. They are a physical manifestation of Samal.
And the example for this?
The source points to the first caliph, Abu Bakr, as the archetype for this temperament. Abu Bakr was historically known for his incredibly soft-spoken wisdom, his gentle demeanor, and his ability to maintain peace in times of panic. He was pure Samal.
Now, I know exactly what you were thinking as you listen to this from your car or your kitchen right now. This sounds dangerously close to biological determinism. It sounds like a built-in excuse for terrible behavior. Like, oh, sorry, I screamed at the barista this morning. My gallbladder was just acting up.
That would be a convenient excuse.
But the lecture anticipates this and makes it very clear that this biological variance is not an excuse for lacking self-control.
Not at all. The lecture is not advocating for determinism. It is advocating for the concept of a divine division of labor. The argument is that human society is an incredibly complex machine that requires a massive, varied diversity of tools to function and survive.
Right. Think about it. If society was composed entirely of calm, gentle, patient people like Abu Bakr, it might be a very peaceful place for a while. But what happens when a corrupt dictator invades? What happens when a building is on fire?
You need action.
The calm mediators aren't the ones who are going to kick down the door and drag people out. You desperately need the explosive fire and immediate action of an Omar to survive a crisis.
And if you reverse the scenario, if society was made up entirely of fiery, aggressive Omars, the society would burn itself out in constant, exhausting conflict. Every minor disagreement would escalate into a war. You desperately need the gentle peacemakers, the diplomats, the Abu Bakrs, to cool the flames and maintain the social fabric.
It's an ecosystem.
Exactly. The source is arguing against uniformity. It says it is a violent violation of human nature to take a person who is biologically encoded with Sinal, someone meant to be a healer or a counselor, and force them into the ring to be a heavyweight boxer.
And it is equally torturous to take a highly active, fiery individual encoded with Selal and force them to sit silently in a cubicle staring at a spreadsheet for 8 hours a day. The society is misusing its tools. So our biological quirks, our hormonal balances, our natural dispositions, whether you are quick to anger or slow to react, these aren't accidents.
No, they're intentional.
They aren't flaws. According to this framework, they are literally the specific precision-engineered tools assigned to you so that you can fulfill your unique role in the universe.
The historical theory regarding the ratio of fluid in the gallbladder serves as a powerful metaphor for the intricate, intentional design of your specific personality. You are granted your exact, unique ratio of Selal and Semal because the world requires exactly what you were designed to do.
Man, what a profound, exhausting, exhilarating journey this has been today. We have covered an incredible amount of ground, mapping the architecture of this specific worldview.
We really went deep.
We started by examining Moses' prayer, learning that the tongue is useless without the engine of the engaged mind. We confronted the terrifying passage of time, challenging ourselves to become the intentional subjects of our lives rather than the passive objects. We navigated the sheer impossibility of the human brain trying to grasp the infinite, realizing that we must climb the conceptual ropes of divine attributes to elevate our minds above idolatry.
We unpacked the 3 categories of existence, discovering that the blinding intensity of the necessary existence makes arguments for random coincidence logically absurd. We explored the devastating moral collapse caused by the inverted blueprint of secular reductionism, a system that strips away the sacred and leaves humans viewing each other merely as meat and bone.
We analyzed the psychological trap of the distant God, revealing how ancient polytheists and modern humans alike build intermediaries to lobby the heavens. And we countered that anxiety with the profound comfort of the God who is closer than the jugular vein. And finally, we landed on the divine biology of our own temperaments, recognizing that the rose and the thorn, the fire and the calm, are perfectly balanced tools in a grand cosmic division of labor.
And as we close this deep dive, there is one final lingering thought that emerges from this beautiful conclusion about human temperaments. It is a thought experiment that builds directly on everything we have mapped out today.
Let's leave them with something heavy. Lay it on us.
We established that your specific temperament, your exact biological and spiritual ratio of fire to calm, of Selal to Semal, is not an accident. It is a uniquely designed precision tool meant for a specific vital purpose in the machinery of society. This raises a highly provocative question for you to answer in your own life. If you are perfectly equipped for your unique role, what happens to the world when you spend your entire life trying to suppress your true nature just to imitate someone else's? What vital function in the universe is left permanently undone because you refuse to pick up the specific tools you were given?
That is something to chew on for the rest of the week. Are you burying your fire when the world around you desperately needs a light? Are you hiding your calm when the room desperately needs peace? Stop apologizing for the tools you were given and start figuring out what you are supposed to build with them. Thank you so much for joining us on this massive deep dive. Keep questioning the foundations of your worldview, check your compass, and we'll see you next time.
Today's material explores the profound Islamic theology behind the names of Allah, examining ontological categories, the philosophical pitfalls of Western reductionism, and how divine attributes manifest in both nature and human temperament. So, a key theme running through this material seems to be the constant friction between absolute divinity and our grounded physical reality.
Yeah, that friction is definitely the driving force here. But looking at the structure, the pivot from the 3 strict ontological categories to the critique of Western reductionism creates a really jarring structural friction.
Right. I mean, the author starts by setting up this brilliantly complex theological framework, right?
Exactly. You get this massive, high-level architecture. They outline absolute existence, or varazivu wujud.
Which is God.
Right. Then there's contingent existence, the mumkin, meaning the created universe, and finally, impossible existence. It's timeless, high-level ontology. But then, almost out of nowhere, we get thrust into a socio-historical critique of Marx, Freud, and Darwin.
It's super abrupt. You're mentally prepared to engage with, the incomprehensible essence of God, and the next thing you know, you're reading about 19th century European intellectual history.
Yeah, and that's the primary weakness in this section. This sudden switch from timeless ontology to very specific historical critique disrupts the intellectual pacing. It basically leaves that carefully constructed ontological framework feeling abandoned rather than practically applied.
Because they treat the reductionism of people like Darwin or Marx as just a completely separate philosophical error.
Exactly. It reads like a textbook critique of Western materialism, completely disconnected from those profound theological rules we just spent pages establishing.
So how do we fix that? Because the critique itself isn't wrong, it's just living in the wrong neighborhood, structurally speaking.
Right, so the suggestion here is to anchor that historical critique directly within the previously established framework of abstract versus concrete thinking. That would create a seamless transition.
Oh, I see. So tying it back to cognitive limitations?
Yes, precisely. Instead of treating Darwin, Marx, and Freud as just these separate historical villains making isolated errors, the author should explicitly frame their theories as modern manifestations of concrete thinking.
Which is exactly what the material identified earlier as the root of idolatry.
Exactly. The material says that when the human mind panics because it can't grasp the abstract, absolute, it demands a physical idol.
Right, it needs something to hold on to.
So use concrete examples for this. Show how reducing human psychology entirely to physical libido, like Freud did.
Or reducing all of history to a fight over physical resources, like Marx.
Yes. Frame those as essentially an inability to process the mumkin, the contingent existence, without tethering it to a tangible physical idol.
That is fascinating. It turns a standard historical complaint into a really profound theological diagnosis.
It really does. It elevates the whole argument.
I can see what you're going for here. Let's see how we can strengthen this, though. Because, isn't there a risk that by blending theology with historical critique too smoothly, we lose the distinct power of the theological argument?
How do you mean?
Well, it feels a bit like trying to mix an oil painting with photography. Like, both capture reality perfectly well, but the mediums might clash if we try to force them together on the same canvas.
That's a fair concern. The tension is real. But, is the connection between A and B fully established in the material, or is that an area to potentially bolster? Because I would argue that integrating them actually gives the theology its practical weight.
Okay. Yeah, like it proves the framework actually works in the real world.
Exactly. If you don't connect them, the theology stays entirely theoretical. Applying it to modern psychological phenomena proves it's an analytical tool, not just ancient history.
That makes a lot of sense. And speaking of ancient history, that inability to grasp the abstract naturally leads to the author's next big point about Meccan polytheism.
Right, which is arguably one of the strongest insights in the entire submission.
Yeah, but there's a big but coming, right?
There is. The profound psychological framing of polytheism as a symptom of a distant God is diluted by the subsequent shift to biological determinism.
The tonal whiplash strikes again. Let's unpack that weakness, because the start of that section is absolute gold.
It really is. The author correctly notes that the idolaters actually believed in a creator. If you ask them who made the universe, they'd say Allah.
Right, so their issue wasn't atheism.
Exactly. Their cognitive flaw was feeling that the absolute was overwhelmingly far away. They felt this crippling emotional need for intercessors, a divine bureaucracy, to whisper in a distant God's ear.
It's a beautiful, deeply emotional insight into the spiritual despair behind idolatry.
Yes, but then, immediately, this deeply spiritual insight is undercut by a pivot into literal biology.
Oh, right, the gallbladder thing.
The gallbladder thing. The author starts detailing how the literal amount of bile in a human gallbladder dictates whether they are prone to anger or calmness.
And they map that onto divine attributes, right?
Yeah. They suggest that specific grams of bile physically determine if someone reflects the divine majesty of Salal, like Umar, or the gentle beauty of Jamal, like Abu Bakr.
It feels so out of place. We go from this profound spiritual introspection straight into, like, a gastroenterology textbook?
Exactly. It moves the reader into this dry, almost clinical fatalism. It severely weakens the emotional core of the piece. You're reducing these magnificent historical figures to victims of their own biomechanics.
Which strips away all their spiritual agency.
Entirely. So the suggestion here is to reframe the biological examples so they serve as poetic metaphors for divine closeness, rather than rigid biochemical destiny.
So keeping the physical element but shifting the focus.
Right. As a concrete example, rather than dwelling on literal grams of bile dictating a person's temperament, focus on how these different temperaments represent the close God operating intimately within human diversity.
Okay, I like that.
Frame the physiological differences as a canvas proving that God is so close. His diverse attributes are woven directly into our cellular makeup.
So society needs both the fierce justice of Umar and the gentle compassion of Abu Bakr. And God orchestrates that through diversity.
Yes, it becomes a testament to divine intimacy without getting bogged down in medical mechanics.
Okay, so what I really like about this part is the underlying distinction between merely knowing God exists and truly understanding his proximity. But if we soften the biology like you're suggesting, do we lose the material's firm grounding in physical reality?
You mean the classical idea of the universe as an open book of divine science?
Yeah, exactly. The author seems highly motivated to prove that divine attributes are literally, physically present in our anatomy. If we make it metaphor, do we lose that?
That makes sense, but could the evidence also support a different conclusion, like the idea that hyperliteralism is actually what limits the spiritual impact?
Oh, interesting. How so?
Think about it. When we reduce Amar's profound sense of divine justice to a hyperactive gallbladder, we're actually doing the exact same thing Freud and Darwin did.
Oh, wow. We're edging into the exact same reductionism the author just criticized.
Exactly. If Freud reduced the soul to the libido, we can't accidentally reduce the spirit to bile.
That is such a good point. By focusing on the spiritual resonance, they avoid the trap of biochemical determinism while still grounding it in physical reality.
Precisely. And this ties directly into the author's final confrontation with modern philosophy.
Right. The epistemological challenge of the modern world, the relativity of truth.
Yes. And my topic sentence for this section is, the argument against postmodern relativity risks oversimplifying the source's earlier, highly nuanced points regarding human cognitive limits.
The tonal whiplash is definitely a recurring theme in this submission.
It really is. And the weakness here is that early on, the text beautifully establishes this profound sense of epistemological humility. It admits a massive limit to human certainty because the mind cannot comprehend the absolute essence of God.
We only see the reflection, not the source.
Exactly. But then, when the author starts attacking postmodernism and sophism later on, the tone shifts dramatically to absolute certainty.
They demand this completely black and white moral universe.
Right. They argue that saying there are 6.5 billion individual truths means there is no truth at all. And while the defense of objective truth is important, this sudden tonal shift makes the authors sound simultaneously intellectually humble about God, but dogmatically rigid about human truth.
It's cognitive dissonance for the reader. Like, wait, am I incapable of grasping the absolute, or am I supposed to have absolute certainty?
Exactly. It alienates readers who really appreciated the initial philosophical nuance.
So how do we fix that? Because they still need to defend objective truth.
The suggestion is to harmonize the critique of postmodernism with that initial premise of human cognitive limitation, so both arguments support each other.
Instead of contradicting each other.
Right.
But how concretely do they do that without validating relativism?
The author actually already has the tool for this in the text. They briefly mention the 3 layers of existence.
Oh, the hakiki, zihni, and lisani layers.
Yes! Use those as the concrete examples. Introduce the idea that while absolute truth, hakiki varlik, exists unequivocally in God, human access to it is naturally limited.
Limited to the mental and linguistic layers. Zihni varlik and lisani varlik.
Exactly. So show that postmodernism's flaw isn't that it recognizes different human perspectives. Recognizing that our mental and linguistic maps are flawed is just admitting our cognitive limits.
Which is exactly what the author was arguing in the beginning.
Yes, the actual fatal flaw of postmodernism isn't observing subjectivity, it's denying the existence of the absolute truth behind that subjectivity.
Oh, that is such a clean mechanism.
You can basically say to the postmodernist, your diagnosis that my mental map is incorrect, but your conclusion that the territory itself doesn't exist is catastrophically wrong.
Right. The hakiki exists even if we are trapped in the zihni trying to describe it.
Exactly. It allows the author to systematically dismantle sophism, without losing the humility of their opening argument.
The material definitely makes a strong case for objective truth by highlighting the absurdity of a world without boundaries. Like, if there's no underlying truth, we can't tell the difference between Moses and Pharaoh.
Exactly.
But to your point, does attacking postmodernism so aggressively alienate a reader who actually agrees that human perception is fundamentally flawed?
That's the real danger.
If I already accept my linguistic map is broken, reading an aggressive takedown of relativity might make me just tune out entirely.
Building on that point, what if we looked at it from the perspective of shared human struggle rather than intellectual warfare?
Ooh, I like the sound of that. How would that work?
Instead of framing the postmodernist as a malicious agent trying to destroy morality, frame them as someone who is tragically trapped in the mental and linguistic layers of existence.
They desperately need the rope of the divine names to climb out into the absolute.
Yes, it reframes postmodernism as just another form of the distant God crisis. Because they can't see the absolute, they just assume it doesn't exist, and they end up worshiping their own subjective realities instead.
That makes the argument infinitely more compassionate and tied directly back to the original thesis.
It gives the whole piece a beautiful, cohesive symmetry.
Absolutely. Well, looking at the big picture of this material, the underlying arguments are incredibly potent, but they definitely require some structural realignment to achieve their maximum impact.
Yeah, they just need to be woven together more deliberately.
Exactly. First, ensuring that the historical critique of figures like Marx and Freud isn't a jarring detour. It needs to flow naturally from the ontological framework by framing materialism as a modernized inability to grasp the abstract.
Second, they need to elevate that profound insight regarding the distant God above clinical biological mechanics, reframing human physiological diversity as a poetic canvas for divine closeness rather than rigid biochemical destiny preserves that crucial spiritual agency.
And finally, harmonizing the attack on relativity with the text's opening premise on human cognitive limits. Utilizing those hakiki, zini, and lisani layers of existence allows the author to fiercely defend absolute truth while maintaining deep epistemological humility.
That's the real key to that section.
These adjustments are really all about smoothing the transitions between those towering macro-theological concepts and their specific earthly applications.
Letting the true depth of the theology shine through without the structural friction.
Exactly. We warmly invite the listener to apply these structural and thematic reframes and submit their revised work back to the critique for further exploration.
Welcome to The Debate. You know, whenever we look up at the sun on a clear day, there's this really fascinating physical paradox that happens. We know it is the absolute center of our solar system. It's this massive anchor of gravity that basically keeps our planet from spinning out into the freezing void. But if you try to look directly at it to actually see its essence, you go entirely blind.
Right. It's overwhelmingly present, but completely inaccessible to our direct vision.
Exactly. The light is so intense that the physical eye simply fails. I mean, we only really know the sun through the warmth on our skin, the shadows it casts, and just the way it illuminates the earth around us.
But think about what that actually means, right? We only know it through human skin, human eyes, and human limitations. Like, the sun might be the objective center of the solar system, but the human sensory apparatus is the inescapable center of how that sun is experienced and interpreted.
Yeah, I see where you're going with this.
Right, because if we can only experience the universe through our limited, human senses, it raises a massive philosophical problem. Does absolute objective truth even exist for us? Or is everything fundamentally just a human interpretation?
And that dynamic, I think, perfectly captures the core of our discourse today, because we are exploring a really profound intellectual tradition here, specifically drawing on Islamic philosophical frameworks and contrasting them with Greek and Western paradigms to understand existence, morality, and the nature of the divine.
It's a heavy topic, for sure.
It is, yeah. And it really comes down to this. I look at this framework and I see that meaning, morality, and even human dignity absolutely require a strict metaphysical hierarchy. There has to be an absolute, transcendent anchor, a necessary existence at the dominant center of reality. If you remove that, if you, say, elevate the human or nature to the top, morality invariably collapses into relativistic reductionism. We basically lose our compass entirely.
Well, I come at it from a different way. Even if I grant you that an absolute truth is out there, our comprehension of it is inescapably filtered. I mean, human thought is intrinsically limited. We process the absolute through our biology, our language, our metaphors.
Sure, but
So in practice, the human experience becomes the unavoidable center of how the universe is understood. We don't get to step outside of our own hardware, you know?
Okay, well, let's break down that reality. Because this philosophical tradition maps existence in a brilliantly structured way, dividing all of reality into 3 categories. So the foundation of everything is the absolute or necessary existence, what is traditionally called the vasibul wujud. This is God. The concept here is that this existence is mandatory, self-evident, and requires 0 external proof.
Because to ask for proof implies that it might not exist. Whereas this category is, well, it's the very ground of existence itself.
Precisely. To try and prove this absolute existence is as redundant as trying to prove the sun is shining while its light is physically blinding you. The reality of the absolute is so intense, so overwhelmingly present, that the failure to see it is entirely a limitation of the receiver, not a lack of evidence.
Right.
Then, branching off from that, you have the second category, which is contingent or possible existence. That's the mumkin barlik. This includes us, humans, the universe, everything created. Things that exist but could just as easily not exist because they rely entirely on an external cause.
And just to round out the ontology, the third category is impossible existence, right? The muhal. Like the concept of a square circle or absolute nothingness, which the human mind actually fails to even picture because the very act of visualization implies that something exists.
Yeah, it's a great framework.
I actually love those 3 ontological categories. They map reality beautifully. But I have to bring us from ontology, what is, to epistemology, how we actually know it. Wait, even if I grant that this ultimate reality is blindingly obvious, how does a human brain actually process it? We don't have the hardware to comprehend infinity. The tradition itself admits that humans cannot grasp the essence, the zat, of God. I mean, the human mind simply isn't built for it.
It isn't, you're right, we cannot comprehend the essence directly.
Right, we think purely through induction, deduction, or analogy. We have to map the unknown onto something we already know. It's like trying to run a massive next-generation 3D physics simulation on a computer from 1995. The processor just crashes.
That's a good way to put it.
We cannot think without a background, you know, without a canvas of familiar concepts.
Which is exactly why this tradition emphasizes the divine attributes, the Esma. We aren't left in the dark with a crashing processor. We are given a translation we can actually understand.
Yes, but that translation is my entire point. These attributes are described beautifully as a rope, the hablallah, lowered from the heavens for us to grasp. We climb this rope using our capacity for abstract thought.
And that climbing is essential.
It is, but notice the mechanics of what happens here. If we can only understand the divine by looking at the contingent world, by moving from the art to the artist, from the physical effect to the metaphysical cause, then human perception is the fundamental, unavoidable filter. We can't step outside our own minds.
I hear you, but
if our access to the absolute is entirely mediated by our cognitive processing, then practically speaking, the human mind and its inherent limits act as the functional center of this philosophical universe. We don't experience the absolute, we experience our highly compressed human approximation of it. I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective on what happens when you treat the human approximation as the center rather than the absolute anchor. When you abandon that God at the center hierarchy, you pave a direct road to softism and postmodernism.
Wait, how does acknowledging our cognitive limits inevitably lead to postmodernism?
Because of the philosophical vacuum it creates. If there is no absolute, overriding truth that sits above human interpretation, then every single perspective becomes equally valid. Think about the mechanics of this. You suddenly have 6.5 billion people on Earth with 6.5 billion different truths.
Okay, yeah.
And if everyone has their own truth, objective truth ceases to exist entirely. I mean, without an absolute anchor, how do you logically differentiate between the morality of Moses and the morality of Pharaoh, or Abraham and Nimrod? You're saying it just degrades into a matter of preference?
Exactly. It becomes a matter of raw power and preference, like this is Pharaoh's truth and this is Moses' truth, and whoever has the biggest army decides what goes in the history books. It's philosophically absurd.
Well,
think about it this way. Imagine you're walking down a desolate road and you see 3 bricks perfectly stacked on top of each other.
okay, the classic 3 bricks analogy.
Yeah. You would immediately stop and ask, who put these here? You could brainstorm 50 different scenarios. Maybe a construction worker dropped them. Maybe a child was playing. But you would never, ever conclude that 3 bricks just randomly fell out of the sky into a perfect balanced stack by pure coincidence.
Sure, of course not.
Now, if basic human logic dictates that 3 simple bricks require a conscious agent, attributing the mind-boggling, fine-tuned complexity of the entire universe to blind chance is a massive terminal failure of reason. Acknowledging the absolute creator isn't just some quaint spiritual choice. It's the only logical bulwark we have against intellectual and moral collapse.
I certainly acknowledge the danger of absolute relativism. If truth is just a localized popularity contest, ethics do fall apart. That's a compelling argument. But have you considered the fundamental fragility of the objective access you're claiming we have?
Fragility in what sense? Are you saying logic itself is fragile?
I'm saying the biological vehicle doing the logic is fragile. You're claiming we need this absolute anchor to have perfect objective morality. But human cognitive limits are deeply physiological.
Okay.
Think about the eye and the ear. A human eye literally goes blind temporarily if you look at the high voltage of a welding arc. A human ear cannot register sound above or below certain decibel limits. Like a dog whistle is completely silent to us. Our minds are bounded in the exact same physical way.
I agree. Our minds have limits. That's undeniable.
But if our minds are bounded by the equivalent of visual and auditory spectrums, how can anyone claim to have perfectly objective access to absolute truth? You're critiquing the postmodernists for having 6.5 billion subjective truths, but even your objective morality is still a highly constrained biological human approximation.
I wouldn't call it constrained in that way.
But it is. We are still translating the infinite through a finite machine. We aren't escaping subjectivity. We are just collectively agreeing on a specific, bounded human translation of the divine.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The fact that the human eye has a physical limit doesn't mean the light it sees is an illusion or merely a subjective opinion. The light is real. It exists independently of the eye.
True.
And this is where the hierarchy matters so much. Let's look at how the Islamic paradigm structures this. God at the top, then human, then nature. In this flow, the human takes their value and dignity directly from the transcendent source. Because we are connected to the absolute, we are elevated above mere matter. Now contrast that with the Greek or Western paradigm, which basically reverses the order. Human at the top, then nature, then God.
Right. The worldview where the human is the measure of all things.
Exactly. It's the myth of Prometheus. The human steals fire from the gods to become a god themselves. But here is the tragic irony of that shift. When humans make themselves the ultimate measure of all things, when they remove the ceiling of the transcendent, they are basically trapped in the basement of the material.
Yeah, they lose the upward pull.
There's nowhere left to look for human definition except downward, and the result is that they paradoxically devalue themselves. They reduce humanity to nothing but nature.
You're talking about the great reductionist operators.
Yes. Think about the mechanics of how this happened in modern history. Without an absolute spiritual anchor, Darwin has to reduce the magnificent, soulful complexity of the human being to pure biology and animal instinct. Freud has to reduce the vastness of the human psyche to the libido, to basic sexual and survival drives.
And Marx with economics.
Exactly. Marx reduces all of human history, art, and striving to a material struggle over resources, a fight over economics and bones.
It's the dog metaphor from the text.
It is, and it's a really chilling metaphor. If you ask a hungry dog to describe a human being, the dog doesn't see a philosopher or a poet. The dog basically sees a pair of trousers wrapped around bones and a shirt draped over meat.
Wow, yeah.
If the absolute transcendent source is removed, a human being is just a shirt over meat. There was a tragic, real-world consequence of this mentioned in this intellectual history, a young man in Denmark who committed mass murder. Do you remember what was written on his shirt?
I think it was, humanity is overvalued.
Humanity is overvalued. That is the terminal destination of biological and material reductionism. If we are just competing atoms and biological drives, there is no inherent dignity. Without the absolute, nihilism takes over, and humanity truly is just a shirt over meat.
I hear the passion in that argument, and I have to admit the shirt over meat imagery is undeniably powerful. It really illustrates the danger of a purely material worldview. But I'm genuinely struggling with a paradox here.
Oh.
Yeah, help me reconcile this. Because to me it sounds like a massive contradiction in the very intellectual tradition we're discussing.
A contradiction where?
Well, you just forcefully tore down Darwin and Freud for reducing us to our biology and base drives. But let's look at how this exact philosophical text explains human character types and spiritual dispositions. It explicitly attributes them to biology and chemistry.
You're referring to how the divine attributes, the Esma, manifest differently within different individuals?
I'm referring to the gallbladder. The text brings up the biological balance of bile, the EH15, in the human body. It explicitly states that individuals with bile levels above the standard are naturally fiery, quick to anger, and dynamic.
Right.
These are the people reflecting the attribute of Jalal, which is majesty or wrath, historical figures like Umar and Hussein. Meanwhile, those with bile below the standard are calm, gentle, and reflect Jamal, beauty and mercy, like Abu Bakr and Hassan.
Yes. Biological temperaments correspond to these attributes.
But think about the mechanics of what that actually means. This framework is saying that societal roles and spiritual dispositions are distributed based on the physical weight in grams of bile in a person's gallbladder.
I see where you're going.
I mean, a person cannot sit still at a desk for 8 hours, not because of some elevated spiritual choice, but because of their chemical makeup. If the amount of bile in our organs dictates whether we have the fiery spirit of Umar or the gentle nature of Abu Bakr, isn't this tradition acknowledging that human behavior is profoundly dictated by our biology?
Well,
how is this gallbladder determinism philosophically any different from the physical reductionism of Darwin or Freud that you just condemned?
I really appreciate you raising that because it genuinely sounds like hypocrisy on the surface. I get that. But to understand the difference, we have to look at the direction of causality. The difference between biological reductionism and this paradigm's view of biology is entirely about where the arrow of meaning points.
Go on.
So Darwin and Freud argue that biology is the bottom-level truth. It is the ultimate cause, and consciousness, morality, and spirit are just, accidental byproducts. The human is merely the bile, merely the instinct.
Right.
But the framework we're discussing sees biology not as the absolute source, but as the canvas. The biological constraints are not a reduction. They are a deliberate, diverse reflection of the divine attributes across creation.
So the biology is downstream from the divine intent, rather than being the ultimate creator of intent.
Precisely. Let me offer a different analogy. Think of a master composer writing a symphony, and the biology of human beings are the different instruments in the orchestra. The physics of a cello restrict it to making deep, resonant sounds. The physics of a flute restrict it to high, airy notes.
The hardware again.
Exactly. The instrument dictates the nature of the sound. Absolutely. But you would never say the wood and the strings wrote the symphony. Biology is the physical instrument God uses to manifest these necessary attributes in the physical world.
Like the classic example of the rose and the thorn.
Exactly. The rose reflects Jamal, beauty and softness. The thorn reflects Jalal, majesty and defensive wrath. You wouldn't look at a rose bush and say, why is this aggressive, sharp thorn here next to this beautiful flower? They work in concert.
Right. Society needs both.
Society needs the fiery defenders and the calm peacemakers. So recognizing that bile affects temperament doesn't reduce the human to bile. It elevates the biology from mere meaningless chemistry into a physical mirror of the divine.
Okay. The composer and the instrument analogy is strong. I see the distinction you're making that biology is the instrument, not the composer. But I still argue that if we are forever bound by that physical instrument, the human lens remains our ultimate reality. We can't help but play the music through our own limitations.
How so?
Let's look at the deepest form of human error described in this tradition, because I think it proves my point perfectly regarding how we project ourselves onto the universe.
You mean the idolatry of the Meccan polytheists before Islam?
Yes. There is a fascinating sociological point made here. The polytheists in Mecca actually believed in a supreme God. If you asked them who created the heavens or who brought the rain, they said Allah. But they suffered from what is called the distant God concept.
Wait, they believed God was far away, unreachable, essentially a retired architect who built the universe and stepped back.
Exactly.
And because of that perceived distance, they invented intercessory idols, gods like Lat, Manat, Uzza, Hubal, to act as intermediaries. The core thesis of the Islamic intervention was realizing that God is closer than your jugular vein. You don't reach outward through stone intermediaries, you reach inward.
And I absolutely agree that the closer than the jugular vein concept is a profound spiritual leap. But look closely at the mechanics of how they conceptualize those idols in the first place. It is the ultimate proof of human projection.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, these idols, particularly Lat, Manat, and Uzza, were conceptualized as female. They were seen as God's daughters or a sort of divine harem.
They believed they could use them to persuade him?
Exactly. A logic was, if you want the king to grant you a favor, you don't bother the king directly. You talk to his favorite companion in his pleasant moments, so she whispers in his ear.
Like court politics.
It's exactly like corporate networking today. People think the CEO of a major company is totally unreachable. So what do? They try to buddy up to the executive assistant to get their foot in the door.
Wow, yeah.
The Meccans were treating the creator of the universe like an aloof CEO. They took the terrestrial politics of a royal court, the sociology of earthly persuasion, and just copy-pasted it onto the cosmos. It proves that humans inherently project their own sociology, their own power dynamics onto the divine. We can't help it.
Well, it certainly proves we have a tendency to.
Whether we are building stone idols to whisper in God's ear like an executive assistant, or we are interpreting divine attributes through the heavy grams of bile in our gallbladders, the human lens is stubbornly omnipresent. We construct the universe in our own image.
I don't disagree that humans have a tragic, almost magnetic tendency to project their own limitations onto the infinite. I mean, we drag the transcendent down to our level all the time. But the entire point of revelation in this paradigm is to shatter those very idols.
Sure.
To teach humans abstract thought so they can transcend that primitive, localized projection. You are absolutely right that we are limited receivers. Our minds are finite, our biology dictates our temperaments, and we constantly struggle not to reduce the absolute to our own petty sociology.
It's an ongoing, seemingly impossible battle against our own physical and mental architecture.
It is a battle. Yeah, but that is exactly why the external anchor, the vasibul wujud, the necessary existence, is so critical to maintain. If we can see that everything is just human projection, if we surrender entirely to the idea that we are nothing but our biological constraints and our subjective interpretations, we lose the very basis for human dignity.
You think it goes that far?
Absolutely. Acknowledging a truth that sits infinitely above human interpretation is the only safeguard we have against moral collapse. It is the only thing that pulls us upward and protects us from looking at a human being and seeing nothing but a shirt over meat.
And I maintain that even if that ultimate, absolute truth exists out there in the void, our climb toward it is intrinsically, inescapably human. We rely on our capacity for abstract thought, our physical biology, our gallbladders, and our worldly metaphors to even conceptualize it.
We do use those tools, yes.
We might be desperately reaching for an absolute anchor, but we are doing it with human hands, processing it with human minds. We cannot step outside the human architecture of our own beliefs.
Which means examining these contrasting philosophical frameworks, whether you prioritize the absolute source that pulls us up or the subjective human receiver that grounds us, is just incredibly vital. It reveals the profound, almost dizzying complexity of trying to understand existence itself.
Absolutely. The dynamic tension between absolute truth and human limitation isn't a simple math problem to be solved. It's a reality to be navigated. There is just so much more to explore in this intellectual tradition regarding how we balance the two.
We'll leave the ultimate conclusion to you, the listener. But the next time you step outside and feel the warmth of the sun on your face, ask yourself, are you experiencing the absolute reality of the star that holds the planets in their courses, or are you just feeling the limits of your own skin? Thank you for listening to The Debate.